Let me ask you a question. At what point is a man so mentally ill he's no longer responsible for murder? Is it when he builds furniture from human skin, eats human organs, and wears the faces of the dead? Because in 1957, the law looked at Ed Gein, the infamous Butcher of Plainfield, and saw a man so profoundly broken by psychosis, so completely detached from reality, he died of old age, not in a prison cell, but in a Wisconsin state hospital. He was deemed too insane to punish.
Or is it when a diagnosed schizophrenic, after years of documented hospitalizations, fires his public defender, represents himself at his own capital murder trial, dressed in a cowboy costume, and attempts to subpoena Jesus Christ and John F. Kennedy as witnesses? Because in Texas, the law looked at Scott Panetti and saw a man sane enough to be sentenced to death. He is still waiting for that sentence to be carried out.
A hospital bed versus a lethal injection. The very stark difference in outcomes for two men, both suffering from severe mental illness, both committing heinous crimes. Tonight, we investigate the terrifying blurry line between madness and malice, and ask why one of these men was treated and the other was condemned. What exactly changed in the American justice system between 1957 and today? And what does it mean for our definition of justice?
Welcome to the executioner's pen. The case of Ed Gein, despite its grotesque nature, often feels like a relic from a different era, a time when the legal system, perhaps due to a less adversarial approach or different psychiatric understanding, handled severe mental illness in a way that prioritized treatment over retribution, at least in certain high-profile instances. But the story of Scott Panetti forces us to confront the modern reality of capital punishment for the mentally ill, a reality that is far more complex and, for many, deeply disturbing. To understand this profound shift, we need to first revisit the madness of Plainfield.
Edward Theodore Gein was born in 1906, raised in isolation on a secluded farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, by a fanatically religious mother, Augusta. Augusta preached incessantly about the sinfulness of women, the evils of sex, and the imminent damnation that awaited all but her chosen few. Ed and his brother Henry were kept from the outside world, their every interaction filtered through Augusta's distorted lens. His childhood was a psychological crucible, forging a deeply disturbed mind.
After his father's death in 1940 and his brother Henry's suspicious death in 1944, a death many now suspect Ed himself orchestrated to eliminate a rival for Augusta's affection, Ed was left alone with his mother. When Augusta finally died in 1945, Ed's world collapsed. She was his only emotional connection, albeit a perverse one. Her death left a void he would attempt to fill in the most horrific ways imaginable.
For 12 years after Augusta's death, Ed Gein lived alone in that farmhouse, reading morbid literature and nursing his grief. Then, in November 1957, the disappearance of hardware store owner Bernice Warden led police to Gein's farm. What they found inside defies description. Human remains, skulls, skin, organs were crafted into household items, bowls, lampshades, chairs, leggings, and even a woman's suit fashioned from female skin. These weren't trophies of a serial killer in the conventional sense. They were tools in a twisted attempt to resurrect his mother or physically become her. Gein also confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan in 1954.
Ed Gein was immediately arrested, but the crucial question for the legal system wasn't just what he did, but why. Psychiatric evaluations quickly concluded he was profoundly disturbed. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found mentally incompetent to stand trial. In a system less focused on retribution, and perhaps more open to the emerging fields of psychiatry, the decision was clear. Gein was too insane for prison. He needed treatment.
He spent the rest of his life in mental institutions, a quiet, cooperative patient dying of lung cancer in 1984 at the age of 77. He was never executed, never sentenced to prison. He simply spent his life in a different kind of confinement, under the care of doctors, not guards. This outcome, though unusual today, represented a specific moment in American legal and psychiatric history. But how would the system respond to such a mind today? The case of Scott Panetti gives us a chilling answer.
The story of Ed Gein, grotesque as it is, serves as a benchmark for how profoundly disturbed an individual can be and still be processed by the legal system. But now, we fast forward to a very different era, one where mental illness, particularly severe psychosis, doesn't necessarily act as a shield against the death penalty. If you're finding this analysis compelling, please hit that like button to help more people discover these crucial stories. Your engagement truly helps us shed light on these complex legal and ethical dilemmas. Scott Panetti's story begins in 1958, just 1 year after Ed Gein's arrest, but his life trajectory would take him down a very different legal path. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in 1978, Panetti's life was a cycle of hospitalizations and releases, marked by profound delusions. He believed he was engaged in a holy war against Satan, who he claimed was inhabiting those around him.
In 1986, Panetti was honorably discharged from the Marines due to his mental health. His struggles escalated over the years, leading to bizarre behavior. Setting fire to his home while his family was inside, burying live chickens, and obsessively preaching his distorted religious beliefs. Doctors testified he suffered from delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized thinking.
Then, in 1992, Panetti committed an unthinkable act. In a horrific escalation of his delusions, he murdered his in-laws, Joe and Amanda Alvarado, believing he was battling Satan. He tied up his estranged wife and their young daughter, then bludgeoned his father-in-law to death and shot his mother-in-law. There was no question of his guilt in the act itself, but there was a profound question about his mental state.
Panetti was initially deemed incompetent to stand trial, receiving treatment at a state hospital. But a year later, doctors declared him fit, paving a way for his 1995 capital murder trial in Kerrville, Texas. What unfolded in that courtroom was unlike anything a seasoned prosecutor or defense attorney had ever witnessed. It quickly became the cornerstone of why his case, decades later, still stirs fierce national debate.
Panetti fired his court-appointed attorney, insisting on representing himself. The judge allowed it. He then appeared in court wearing a bright purple cowboy outfit, complete with spurs and a bandana. His defense was surreal. He claimed his multiple personalities were behind the murders, that his legal team was part of Satan's conspiracy, and he tried to call over 200 witnesses to the stand, including Jesus Christ, Pope John Paul II, and John F. Kennedy. He testified in a series of bizarre voices, shifting personas during his testimony. Astonishingly, the prosecution used Panetti's bizarre behavior against him, arguing that his antics were an elaborate ruse to fake insanity. They painted him as cunningly manipulative, not genuinely ill. The jury, faced with a mentally ill man acting out his delusions, found him guilty and sentenced him to death.
This outcome stands in stark contrast to Ed Gein's. In Gein's era, such overt psychosis would have likely resulted in immediate and indefinite institutionalization without a trial. But by the 1990s, the legal landscape had shifted dramatically. Panetti's execution was set multiple times.
But beyond the courtroom, there was a shocking development that solidified Panetti's fate, a development you won't believe.
Panetti's case became a battleground for the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, specifically the clause, clarified by the 1986 Supreme Court case Ford v. Wainwright, that forbids the execution of the insane. The core argument: a condemned prisoner must be rational enough to understand why he is being executed. Panetti's lawyers argued vehemently that he was not.
Throughout his decades on death row, Panetti's mental health continued to deteriorate. He still believed Satan manipulated his lawyers, that the death penalty was a conspiracy, and that he needed to preach the gospel from death row. He refused treatment, claiming it was poisoning him. His legal teams tirelessly argued that to execute a man so deeply entrenched in psychosis would be a barbaric act, violating the very principles that spared Ed Gein.
The case of Scott Panetti has gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, not once, but twice. In 2007, the Supreme Court actually sided with Panetti, reversing a lower court's ruling and establishing a stricter standard for determining a death row inmate's competency to be executed. They ruled that a prisoner must not only be aware of the fact of their execution, but also have a rational understanding of the state's reason for it. This was a landmark decision that should have, in theory, protected individuals like Panetti.
Despite this Supreme Court precedent, Panetti's battle continued. Lower courts, applying the new standard, repeatedly found him competent, arguing that while he had delusional beliefs, he still had a factual understanding of his impending execution. This highlights a critical and often frustrating aspect of legal and psychiatric intersection. Even with clearer guidelines, interpreting an individual's rational understanding when that individual is profoundly psychotic remains incredibly challenging and subjective. What one doctor sees as a delusion, another court may interpret as a mere eccentric belief.
Panetti is not alone. His case is emblematic of a broader systemic issue across America's death rows. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, a significant percentage of inmates on death row suffer from severe mental illness. We see cases like Andre Thomas in Texas, who due to psychosis gouged out both of his own eyes in 2 separate incidents while in prison. Yet he too was deemed competent for execution.
These cases force us to ask, what if the very system designed to protect the insane is now failing them at their most vulnerable? Is the bar for competency set so low that it effectively bypasses the spirit of the Eighth Amendment? Are we as a society simply more comfortable executing a monster than treating a madman, even when the distinction is so agonizingly blurred?
The difference in outcomes for Ed Gein and Scott Panetti is stark. Gein, a product of a different legal era, was pathologized. Panetti, a product of our own, has been condemned. This isn't to say either man is innocent of their crimes, nor is it to diminish the unimaginable suffering of their victims. But it is to highlight a fundamental question about our justice system. Is its primary goal always retribution, or does it still uphold the principle that certain individuals, because of their profound illness, exist outside the realm of moral culpability that capital punishment demands?
Ed Gein's case, frozen in time, serves as a haunting reminder of what was once legally possible for the profoundly disturbed. Scott Panetti's ongoing struggle, however, is a living, breathing testament to the profound challenges and ethical dilemmas our modern justice system still grapples with. The debate is far from over.
This case, like so few others, truly forces us to question our core beliefs about justice, mental illness, and the state's power over life and death. If you believe this conversation is vital, please subscribe to the Executioner's Pen. Your support allows us to continue these in-depth investigations into the dark corners of our legal system.
The story of Scott Panetti is so complex, so deeply troubling, it truly deserves its own full-length investigation. We've only scratched the surface tonight. If you want to see a dedicated deep dive into Scott Panetti's life, his profound psychosis, and every twist and turn of his decades-long legal battle, let me know in the comments below. Your feedback directly shapes our next investigation.